Life, liberty, and property do not exist because men made laws. On the contrary, it was the fact that life, liberty, and property existed beforehand that caused men to make laws in the first place. Frédéric Bastiat, The Law. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Gap Fillers Podcast, episode number 17. My name is Michael Bradford, and let's get started here. Two big things I want to focus on today. The Florida legislature has stalled out. Practically nothing got done this week. They spent the rest of Friday passing bills back and forth between the House and Senate, not able to agree on anything. We'll get into that. And I want to focus a little bit on the loneliness epidemic in America and what that means. I'll get into that. But first, let's get into this legislative stall out, so to speak. Basically, what happened is that on Friday, nothing got done, and that was supposed to be the end of the session. Well, according to the Florida State Constitution, we have to have a balanced budget. So, because a balanced budget did not get passed, the lawmakers have to stay in Tallahassee a little bit longer. They are taking about a 2-week break, but are supposed to be back by the 15th and will continue pounding it out until June. Let's see here. The end of the regular session was May 2nd, and then they did all their stuff, and so they actually have to have some. The session is extended till June 6th, and then they have until July 1st to finish. So they're coming back. On May 12th, going to June 6th, and have to be done constitutionally before July 1st. So we'll get into that. Basically, what happened is there is a massive backlog of bills in the Florida legislature. This has become a problem, as I kind of foresaw it. This happens a lot when you have a lopsided government, pretty much no strong opposition. The party itself in power becomes its own opposition, especially if you don't have a strong figurehead. In something like in China, right, where you have a single party state, communist, you have subdivisions of factionalized groups within the government, and that's basically kind of what's happening. So Florida is a supermajority state for the Republicans, which means that they should get a lot done, right? Well, no. Why? Because there's not a strong figurehead anymore. DeSantis, at the beginning, in his first term, was a strong figurehead through COVID, and that became an issue when he ran for president, and it kind of, he spent a lot of political capital fighting Disney and all that, kind of set him up for the run. But going against Trump, there was no way that he was going to beat the Trump loyalists, so there was no way for him to win, and he basically spent almost all of his political capital on that. He got reelected, and he's term limited out, so there's no chance for him to be running again, and so there's no political strength behind him anymore. This is a problem, when you don't have a strong figure. Even if he's not running, he's almost a lame duck at this point. Even with 2 years left to go, or a year and a half left in his term. So people have started vying up for the governorship, which creates more factionalism. Okay, in a heavy Republican state, you'll have more factionalism as the party kind of doesn't coalesce around one person. So basically, you have more of a Whig form of opposition as opposed to a Democrat form of opposition, where it's you're no longer fighting, or a Republican. So you have a Republican versus Whig as opposed to Democrat, or vice versa. And so they basically disagree around minutiae of deals, and the smaller forms, the smaller issues tend to pop up into be bigger issues, especially if there's no mandate for a specific issue. And this is where this is the idea of where a lot of opposition kind of disintegrates and then reforms into something else. With national parties, it kind of stays the same, and that's what usually holds these state parties together is the idea of federalism and actually anti-federalism and being one giant state. And so it's easier to run for a national state because that's divided as opposed to a local state, one like Florida. And so they're arguing over basically this is what's going on. The House and Senate failed to agree on a balanced budget, which is a constitutional requirement. All right, and then the House had proposed a bill of $112 billion, almost $113 billion, and the Senate had proposed $117 billion. Okay, that creates a $4 billion gap, which is basically become a talking point between these the two leaders in the House or in the legislature. Daniel Perez is the speaker. He is not going to be running for another term, but this is also the second time he's also kind of made a fuss over a bill. Earlier, he made a fuss over DeSantis's bill, kind of trying to steamroll the legislature, and basically that was the first nick in the armor of DeSantis throughout his governorship. That happened earlier this year, and also another person who's being term limited is Ben Albertin, who's the Senate president. So these two guys are going at it. Is definitely looking like he's at least going to make a go for the governorship or maybe a statewide office. His proposal in the House would have lowered the state sales tax from 6% to 5.25%. So it would have reduced basically almost 3/4 of a cent on the dollar. So if you basically you would be paying 5.25 cents on every dollar that is applied on the sales tax. This would kind of be good overall. I generally support tax cuts wherever they can come from. I'm more focused on residential tax cuts as opposed to statewide tax cuts that would kind of help benefit or not benefit, but less tax the tourist industry. I'm very in favor of basically prioritizing residential taxation or getting rid of residential taxation for more tourist taxation. Although I do think we need to encourage more local industry and production, and I'll actually get into that hopefully in a little bit. So that's what's happening. There's a $4.4 billion gap. Albertin thinks this is going to cause shortfalls in the future. This was also, there was also a couple, misallocations or arguments over education and healthcare budgets, and so between that and the sales tax is really what's happening. And then you have factionalism within the House, within their own groups. Like I said, this will tend to happen when you have a fractionalized government or and a lack of opposition. So why has it taken so long for this to even be brought up? Well, there's one thing called legislation overload. Okay, so almost 2,000 bills have been filed since May, since the opening of this session. Okay, 2,000 bills. All right, and only 243 have been passed, this is very unlikely or unusual. Everybody has their own little niche thing that they want to get passed, and it has to make its way through subcommittees and committees. And because state legislatures aren't always in session, and they don't take as long. There's less of a session period as opposed to Congress. They're all, every state differs, but 2,000 bills is a lot to even consider to be passed. So everybody kind of works out their own thing, and nothing gets done because there's no strength behind any one person to coalesce behind, like Trump. So Trump, which is an odd thing because the House is kind of the House of Representatives is kind of dragging its feet, and the Senate's also dragging its feet. That's why Trump is acting by federal decree, pretty much, and nothing's getting done in the legislatures because it's too gridlocked. So you almost have two ways of getting deadlocked here. You get deadlocked when you have too many things to get, or too much of a lead, and you get deadlocked when you don't have enough of a lead, because that makes everybody's bills kind of basically jammed up. Okay, so people in danger of losing their seat are less likely to vote for something that doesn't have a strong mandate behind it, and where these people's seats, and so they're less willing to take risks. And so that's what happens when you have not enough of a lead. When you have too much of a lead, the party itself becomes its own opposition, and that's basically is what happened. Anywhere from let's see here, the Hope Florida initiative, open carry reforms, medical malpractice reforms, anything, literally everything is on the table here. No fault auto insurance, there's a whole list here. So that is it. That is a huge problem. Let's see here. Let's see here. Sorry, excuse me. The insurance crisis. There's a lot of insurance going through the roof, especially when it comes to housing, primarily because of the hurricanes that have come through, but also because of government regulation and the lack of maneuverability when it comes to insurance companies. There are fewer competitors, and it's harder to get in business in an insurance company. Therefore, you have basically pile-ups in premiums on that, or people leaving the state altogether, people being insurance companies. So let's see here. The House pushed a $5 billion tax cut, as we mentioned, and the Senate couldn't agree to that. So between that and lobbying between other groups, this whole thing has become gridlocked. Basically, what needs to happen now is they're going to come to an agreement. Probably no large bills are going to be passed. I don't foresee anybody being able to coalesce around a huge reform. I see them eventually coming to a deal with insurance and stuff like that, because that's actually a hot topic. But between gun laws, probably not going to be passed. I don't foresee that really. Gun law reform. There's not a huge push in either direction, as Florida is a constitutional carry state, which means you don't need a permit to carry concealed. So I don't see anything like that. But the insurance, I do actually see something like that getting done. As on the margins, I don't see it being a huge shift. A massive restructuring of the insurance industry in Florida. But this is basically become its own implosion. It's like a star getting too big and basically the gravity imploding on itself, becoming a neutron star or a supernova. When a mass gets too big or it becomes a black hole. Either way. Anyways, not to get off topic on that. But the other thing I wanted to talk about was the loneliness epidemic in America. This is from NPR. There's an epidemic of loneliness in the United States. All right. This is if you have loneliness, they classify it as comparing it to smoking 15 cigarettes a day, according to the Surgeon General. This is in 2023. Okay. The report released on Tuesday. This was a while ago. Basically stated that there was a loneliness and isolation epidemic, and warns that physical consequences of poor connection can be devastating, including a 29% risk of heart disease, a 32% increase in risk of stroke, and a 50% increased development of dementia for older adults. All right, so they can't put a price tag on it, but basically here's what's happening. There is a large portion of the United States that is no longer basically interacting with anybody. Okay, across age groups, between people spending less time with each other in person than 2 decades ago. The advisory reported that this was most pronounced in young people, 15 to 24%, who had 70% less social interaction with their friends. Again, from NPR. So that is a huge gap. All right, so in fact, 15 to 24 year olds should have the most friends, not the least friends. There's that joke that's kind of, tongue in cheek. Jesus' biggest miracle was being 30 and having 13 or 12 friends, close friends. And so that's kind of the joke. But the idea is that as you get older, it gets harder to maintain close contact with friends. As you get busier in life, you should have less. You're in theory going to have less contact. Now you'll have closer contact, but less overall contact, right? So as you get older, you should marry, and you'll have a family, and you might take care of a loved one, and so you'll have close contact in that regard. However, you'll have less outward contact, right? You won't be hanging out with your friends on the weekend. You won't be doing a lot of stuff. At least that's less likely as trends have gone. Okay, but basically, he basically Murthy says this is the Surgeon General. Basically has stated that social media is to blame for young people. Basically, they're replacing social media with in-person relationships. This means less quality relationships. Why? Because you're not meeting somebody face-to-face. You don't get that full interaction with somebody. Like me talking over this microphone, there's not as much person-to-person contact. You can't see what my facial reactions are. Even if I had a camera, which I am eventually planning on doing, you still don't see full environmental interaction. And that becomes a huge issue. Basically, he made an advisory. This is old news. But basically what I want to get at is that I want to basically call this out for the lack of a standardized culture throughout America, right? America has always, been an area of consistently changing and shifting culture. In the early Americas, it was less drastic, but as inventions and mobility became more of a thing with the invention of the railroad, and then you had a mass migration, you had basically coalescing into two massive groups of different cultures, right? You had the North and the South. Now, the South was heavily traditional, whereas the North was heavily changing because of all the immigrants, right? Now, this doesn't mean that there wasn't a base core in the North, which basically allowed it to coalesce into a centralized power, right? And basically, that's one of the ways that they overpower the North, or overpower the South rather, is that they had this large group of cultures that were kind of able to be integrated into each other. But that was also because they had a common enemy, or a common, a common large culture beside them that was kind of parallel to them, which was the South, which after the Civil War you see kind of breaks apart. In fact, this comes up into Florida politics, right? Is the people that are moving here from all over the country tend to be more Republican. Right, as Florida's population has grown, it becomes more Republican. However, a Republican from California is not the same Republican that was here originally, that has grown up in Florida. Right, so we have different values. Same come from a Republican of a different nationality, even a different community. Now, this could be this could be a strength, or it can be a weakness, right? If there's not a centralized culture to coalesce around, which in the past, over the past 250 years, less so in the last 100 years, has been Christianity and Jesus Christ. Right, you coalesce around the Bible, or the core values at least. Right, even if you are Protestant or Catholic, which have definitely had their own battles in American history, the basics are kind of the same. Right, where major strife has happened is like between the Mormon Church. That was a huge qualm because they're not Christians. They don't believe that Jesus Christ alone, and they have different theology altogether. Whereas Protestants and Catholics at least believe in several core tenets of faith. Now they vary widely. However, at the end of the day, it's easier for a Protestant and a Catholic to get along than a Muslim, because the Muslim has a completely different culture, right? Or foundational in their culture, right? So the basis of the Bible is what people would say is the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right? And that's not a tenet in pretty much any that's from the Bible, right? That is love God and love thy neighbor is the two greatest laws. The first being the greatest, but overall, as the U.S. becomes more atheistic, there is less of a foundational culture, right? Atheism doesn't have a foundational culture, right? You can say it's science, but science is heavily biased in worldview. So it depends on what cultural standpoint you want to come from, right? Because it's not a foundation, because it's an observation, and there's not a large correlation behind it. That's something that that France ran into with the French Revolution, is they became heavily atheistic and basically kind of imploded on itself, becoming more of a power dynamic with Napoleon. And then you had massive upheaval between throughout the 19th century because of that, because there was no foundational group of foundation. We all agree that this is the baseline, and that's what basically this leads me into a post I made earlier this week, which is I said something to the effect as culture matters more than any law, right? And now I had a buddy, good friend of mine from the Army, basically say, well, no, because Muslims believe that you can marry have sex with a 5-year-old, which is exactly my point. Okay, so my point is not that any law matters more than, or any culture matters more than any law. I meant that culture of itself matters more than any law, right? You can make a law in America, right? And then you move a Muslim to America, and if they think they can get away with it, if they don't view it as an immoral act, they're more likely to try to get away with it if they think they can. Okay? So it is your cultural worldview determines a lot on what you can, what you will and won't do under normal circumstances if you think you can get away with it, right? You see this with, this is one of my my issue that I really gets under my skin is kind of bikers, and bicyclists are kind of lumped into this group too. They because they're a two-wheeled vehicle with a low physical footprint, they try to they can get away with getting away with not obeying traffic laws, right? Whether that is lane splitting, which is not legal but in California, and then you have cutting off and not obeying stop signs and different things like that. Now, that is a view of cultural degradation in my view, okay? Because even if there's no way to get around catching somebody lane splitting unless a cop is sitting right there, right? Now, I understand why they say they lane split. However, cutting me off 2 seconds after lane splitting doesn't really classify in my book as you're concerned about safety, right? You just want to cut to the front of the line, and that's where cutting in front of the line is it's a very hedonistic, selfish worldview to have. Now, you might think that's nothing, and in actuality, it probably is. But it doesn't get around the fact that you still have cars that will kind of act the same way on the road at the same time, right? Going straight from a turn lane to get around 10 cars in traffic, right? That is saying, I'm better than you. If I can get away with it, and it doesn't hurt anybody, why do it? Well, because cultural and societal regulations matter, right? I don't run a red light in the middle of the night not because I'm afraid of getting caught or because I want to lick some boots, right? I don't do it. I do it out of the principle of I don't run a red light because it's not right to do it, right? Now that is, again, might seem very odd, and but if you're willing to sacrifice your morals over a small thing, what guarantee can you give me that you won't sacrifice it over a big thing, right? If you can steal $1 million and get away with it, would you? If it was $1, would you? It's very it plays in a lot to what this thing I've been researching is game theory, right? Is basically it creates this if you have two people in competition with each other, right, in a game, so to speak, what are you willing to give up in order to win? Okay, and that's where your culture overall has to draw a line, right? It kind of is the antithesis. It's not, culture doesn't base itself on reason for the most part, right? Because on short-term reason, rather, it bases itself over long-term reason, and saying that this culture, the reason I act this way overall is because this will happen. This will prolong the civilization, basically. And doing or morality, or because it's moral, right? And this gets down to the Muslim, marrying a 5-year-old kind of deal, right? Is that right? Is that moral or not? Well, let's see. Let's compare civilizations and find out. Well, surprise, surprise, the culture that marries 5-year-olds is degraded and warlike and basically anarchist at every point, where groups and bands of military groups rule the world. Right now, this is where the fear of American cultural degradation comes in. Okay, is that America doesn't have a unified culture anymore. Right, we are almost held together more by law than by culture. Right, because there's so many cultures, right? If the cultures tend to interact when they come into contact, right? They tend to kind of fight when they come into contact, right? Again, like I said, Catholics versus Muslims in the medieval period, or Catholics versus Protestants in the late mid-American period. Okay, and basically what we're running into now is that we have so good of a life here that we have traded cultural foundations for basically hedonistic values today. Okay, you have more of a rat race theory. I gotta get my buck. I gotta get the house. I gotta get that next big thing. I gotta get the iPhone, whatever it is now. I don't even remember. The last one I remember is 10. After that, I stopped. Well, I stopped caring a long time ago with any of that. But overall, I gotta have the nicest car. I gotta have this newest thing to signal to everybody that I am better, or I am at least keeping up with them. Right? I'm not poor. Right, and so they don't want to look like they're not succeeding, in which actually causes them to not go as far. It's almost a beta paradox. Okay, and basically what happens when you can no longer do this, right? It creates a race to the bottom. How much money can I not save in order to win today and sacrifice tomorrow? Okay, a society doesn't last when that is the majority, even a large minority of view from its society, right? It works on a small scale, and that's why it ends up starting in the first place, right? So if you're willing to, if you have this Machiavellian setup mindset that I just need to do what I can to get ahead, morals don't matter, then at the end of the day, I can get ahead, right? You saw this with the in early American with a lot of the industrialization, especially mid-American with the during the Gilded Age, right? And that's where you saw depressed wages, the railroads were a mess, stuff like that. Okay, and then post World War II, it's become a much larger scale because there was a lot more resources centered in America, because basically the world had destroyed itself, which being Europe. And in doing so, we have helped build the rest of the world over the past 100 years at the degradation of ourselves, slowly but surely, right? Now, if we're making $1 million and we're giving out 100,000, that might not seem like much, but eventually it's going to reach an equilibrium where it's now a 60-40 or a 55-45, okay? And so you're almost focused now. The world has pretty much caught up, besides some of South America and some of Africa, right? A large portion of sub-Saharan Africa is the only part of the world that's left in basically extreme poverty, okay? And the idea is, what do you do about people who are living in extreme poverty? Well, if you need people to have a standard of living, to have a culture, you can't just give them free stuff, because that it actually degrades their culture overall, because it takes away meaning, in which is part of what adds to a society, and meaning and culture and duty, and the sense of duty, and things like that. And that's what America has lost because of its decadence. That's what the West has lost, especially Europe. Europe is atrocious. A lot of Southeast Asia is still kind of there, but they haven't built they've basically built their entire society on slave labor, funded by American companies. And so when I hear about this, free market stuff, I'm 100% free market. However, not free market at the expense of everything else. Okay, and so this is what happens. You have a race to the bottom, and you end up with something called the Nash equilibrium, where you end up with a thespian Thucydides, Thucydides trap of sorts. It doesn't mean, for those who don't know, Thucydides trap is basically when a country is on the rise and catches up to another civilization, and they come in contact with each other, things tend to happen, which is often war, right? And this trade war is almost a version of that. And so basically what I'm getting at here, though, is with the prisoner's dilemma, is now we're kind of like, okay, well, we have to make a move. Well, for years we have been making a move that basically allows them to take a slight ahead, right? So in order to maintain our hegemony over the world, we have allowed China to catch up at the expense of ourselves, our manufacturing, our culture, our traditions, and we have willingly sacrificed those in order to gain cheap product, right? And so cheap product overall for a materialist society, eventually you eventually even out, and now you're at Thucydides trap of okay, China is the second largest civilization. They outnumber us like 3-1, but they now outrank us on manufacturing by a large percentage. The only place that they don't is military spending, pretty much. Our economy is still bigger, but our economy depends heavily on them. And if it came to blows, they could transfer their manufacturing base over to a wartime base, and we don't have a manufacturing base overall. Okay, all that to say is that this is what I've been getting at over the past few weeks. If you don't build stuff, if you don't create something, you end up with a degrading culture, and people don't identify. They don't know what it means to be an American anymore. That's why they constantly are like, well, we have a right to health care. Well, we have a right to free food. We have a right to education, right? And we have these rights which have never been rights before in human history, let alone American history. And they all of a sudden we've become less American and more of this, what can my country do for me, as opposed to what can I do for my country, right? And this basically degrades its culture into loneliness, and we no longer identify with other Americans, right? Floridians barely identify with other Floridians. Florida man, the idea of Florida man is a lot of the old Florida. And basically, they're being crazy guys that wrestle gators and do wild things. That's almost the last gasp of Florida culture, right? And there's very few people that think about cattle as being from Florida. It's still a huge industry, but nobody thinks about that. Nobody thinks about orange, or everyone thinks about oranges coming from Florida when orange industries have declined 90% in the last 20 years. Okay? So overall, what does it mean to be a Floridian, right? Somebody who's crazy, maybe freedom. People think Disney. Disney's definitely not Florida. I'll die on that hill. So what does it mean to be Florida? Beaches? It's a very hedonistic point of view. When you get down, and that is a degradation of culture, not a solidification of culture. Okay, so overall, this is what lends itself to the cookie cutters and cookie cutter houses and stuff, and you don't see unique things being built in Florida, right? All the stuff is generic garbage because there's no culture, right? These corporations utilizing game theory basically are playing to the lowest or the greatest common denominator, and basically trying to tread through 15 different cultures and or subcultures, and what they end up with is this homogenous, brutalistic point of view that has no cultural identity whatsoever. A golf course is not cultural identity. A home that looks like it's 4 squares put together is not cultural identity. There's no aesthetic value to it. And that's a lot of what it comes down to. We've traded Florida forests, swamps, and savanna lands for generic homes and heavily fertilized fields of grass to play golf on. And we actually have dying out species because of that. There's the Florida mink, the Florida panther. 90% of the Florida mammals in the Everglades have disappeared. Now, most of them are still there, but because of anacondas being brought in, pythons. Tomato on that one. But overall, then you have an erosion of society. You have less gaps between rural and urban, and then that comes into contact. You raise the prices on rural areas the closer that the urban centers get to it, and you just speed up the process of cultural erosion. So, all in all, what can we do? What is the call to action on this? If you do not want the government, the law, to act, you must culturally take a stand. We must willingly, as a population, turn to Christ, turn to a cultural foundation to build it upon. Okay? We must coalesce into an identity that is Florida. We must produce stuff. We must maintain the old stuff. There's this saying that you reject modernity and embrace tradition. Embrace tradition and integrate modernity, right? You don't have to not have internet. You don't have to not have convenience to be rule, to have tradition. But if the tradition is sacrificed at every turn for convenience, you'll lose it. It's the freedom for security. If you're willing to trade freedom for security, you'll get neither. Well, freedom demands responsibility, and that's what we need to do. We need to, as individuals, have a call to action that we interact with others in a civilized manner, at the very minimum, right? You don't speed on the highway like a maniac. I'm not saying you obey the speed limit at every turn. I don't do that. But don't also drive like a maniac. Don't force others to abandon their civilization, because of banditry on others. This is what happens highly in urban areas, as there's less freedom and responsibility, or more. In actuality, there's more freedom in urban areas, so to speak, because you can do 1,500 different jobs. In a rural town, there might be two. And there's farming and there's this one mill, and that's pretty much it, kind of thing. Or you can move. But that's your three options. Whereas in the city, there should be more freedom. But in actuality, when enough people are allowed to fail, they will, and you'll end up with a bell curve you have highly successful, people on one end, and then you have the least successful on one end, and then you end up with the groups fighting each other, and then it spreads out. As the poor get poorer, the rich get richer, but also the middle class kind of has a more even distribution, right? In fact, what you don't want is the bell curve to inverse, basically, where the people in the middle are actually the least population, and that's what actually tends to happen as societies go along and abandon their culture, right? This kind of goes into what Christ said: let the rich be made your footstool, and exalt the poor. That doesn't mean that doesn't mean to overall degrade rich people, but rich people, whoever you would classify that. If you're middle class in America, you're one of the top 1%. If you live in America at all, if you live in today's society at all, you're in the top 1% in all of human history. So stop comparing yourself to others like that, but embrace the cultural traditions of the past while integrating the future, right? One last thing before I let y'all go, the church has been guilty of this. Okay, the church has no longer been a moral authority, which is one of the things that the church is called to do. The biggest thing is lead people to Christ, but we are called to be a peculiar people, okay? And that means to be outside of the world, but influence the world. The problem is that we have now introduced game theory into American churches. We trade this traditional church that unites culturally, and it becomes the cookie cutter church in a box, and that's one thing that I've seen a lot through all denominations, not just non-denominational churches, but through Lutheran, through Methodist especially. There's no longer an embrace of biblical values, and it's become more of a feel good. How can I reach the most people and that ends up being saying the least. It's very Machiavellian. You no longer express moral purpose and values, and the ultimate purpose is to lead others to Christ. You no longer see that. It's more of hey, let's see how much I can influence the culture without influencing the culture, right? Butts in seats as opposed to butts to Christ or hearts to Christ. All right. So on that note, I'll go ahead and leave it. I appreciate y'all for joining me this week on the Gap Fillers podcast. If you want to support, you can like, comment, share the show. That's the only way I'm going to grow, or we're going to grow as a podcast. I'm going to definitely have. I'm looking at getting a couple of guests on, kind of interview style. That'll be interesting. You'll see that when I have no official dates yet, but that's something that I'm working on. Video is something I'm also going to be working on. And again, it's Gap Fillers 1776 on X, and then Florida Gap Fillers Podcast on Twitter, or not Twitter, on Facebook. So again, if you can subscribe on YouTube or on Instagram or on Spotify, that would be great. And if you hit that bell, you'll never miss an episode. Thank you, and have a good week.